Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today, we're going to turn attention to Afghanistan and the major resistance movements that are attempting to organize against the Taliban. Today, my guest is Will Selber. He's a retired Middle East Foreign Area Officer. He deployed over 4.5 years to both Iraq and Afghanistan and spent some time in Afghanistan at the end. Will, welcome to Generation Jihad.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I was telling my wife that if Captain Will Selber knew that he'd be on Generation Jihad, he wouldn't believe it. I long-time listener, first-time caller. At any time when I was in Afghanistan and I thought, hey, you know what? Maybe we got something going here. I would make sure to listen to you, and you and Jocelyn would get on and be like, yeah, this isn't going to work. And I'm like, no. So I always, if I ever had a little bit too much opium going through me, I always make sure to get a little dash of reality. And so it's an honor to be here. I love y'all's work and everything that y'all did during the Long War. Your products were used throughout the IC. I would sit in on briefings many a time, and I'm like, I know that Afghan control map. I've seen that before.
Yeah, Will, this is the tough part of the job, right? I mean,
yeah, of course.
I started in this career as an optimist, right? I was one of the few people you could fit in a phone booth in Washington who believed that the surge in Iraq had a chance, and it did, right? The Al-Qaeda in Iraq was beat back. It took, it took a couple of years of hard fighting, but it happened, and it was our exit from Iraq, and we took our eye off the ball, our inability to fight long wars, right?
Right.
And that was a learning process for me. Our tactics and our strategy was good, but our will was weak.
Iffy.
Yeah.
And everybody can see that, right? If you're showing that you don't have the will to fight, or you keep on messaging that you don't, then your enemies will pay attention to you and adjust their strategy accordingly.
Yeah. And absolutely. And you said it. I mean, the enemy's watching, and we know the Taliban had to watch U.S. operations, counterinsurgency, and its will in Iraq and in other theaters as well. And I get accused of being a pessimist, or even General Miller. I don't know if you saw this in his testimony to Congress.
I saw General Miller's comments.
He called Tom. He said we were antagonistic to the military. We did.
I just don't agree. I mean. I have a lot of respect for General Miller. He's had a great long career. I was there with him the last year in Afghanistan. I was serving inside the embassy. And look, I mean, everything you guys were saying during that last year was coming true. And this idea of that the Doha Agreement was a complete disaster, that it didn't release all these prisoners, that we released Mullah Baradar, who then came back and swindled us out of this deal. I mean, all that stuff. Now, I saw it firsthand, and I saw firsthand the Taliban repeatedly break the Doha Agreement throughout that final year. And it was obvious to anybody who was paying attention.
Yeah, we said what we said and did what we did in hope that the message would come through, that things weren't working, that we could change course. It was never intentionally. I served the military myself.
Yeah.
I love my country.
Absolutely.
Critical of the U.S. Army or anyone. I mean, and ultimately these were political decisions too.
Absolutely.
But, any criticism, whatever is perceived as being antagonistic really was in an effort to help serve the cause, to not even necessarily win in Afghanistan, but to not lose. Right.
Right.
And
yes.
we couldn't even accomplish that, could we?
No, we couldn't. And, I think that one of the many tragedies of the Afghan war is that now we have an inability to tell the truth about what happened, and that we retreated, and that we left a lot of our allies behind, and that everybody watched us do that. And we might not remember that way, but that's how a lot of people see it. And I mean, that is the way that we left, the way that it went down, and then to turn around and blame a lot of the Afghans for the fact that that they fell apart on one day, which isn't true, as it left a lot of bad taste in a lot of people's mouths.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
that Afghanistan collapsed in 11 days.
Yeah,
General Milley and others said it was
absolutely not true.
absolutely not true. You were there, right?
I was there. I was there the last year, and I know that I would just say this is that every most of the people who could watch, and I watched the war that final year, is that the Taliban's approach to us was just you have to respect their game and what they were able to do by telling us that no, we were going to do these reduction in violence, just release 5,000 prisoners, and we just kept on doing it, and we just kept on doing it, and giving these things to them, and they're like, oh well, you can't do offensive operations, but you can do something that we called active defense, quotes around that. And that's what the Afghans had that last year. And I just, the Talibs, to their credit, they did a ruthless assassination campaign that final year. And they killed Afghan Air Force pilots, commandos, their families. It was very effective, very effective.
It really was. You said it. You have to respect what they did. We don't have to like it. I don't. But as a dare we say, we're practitioners, right? We we know what success looks like. We know how they waged an effective insurgency and how they were able to, not just defeat the Afghan government, but to trick us. Not even say trick isn't the right word. We deluded ourselves.
Yes.
Or convinced ourselves we can leave in the manner by trusting the Taliban, and we never
always a bad idea to trust the Taliban. Never a good idea.
I mean,
I've talked to Talibs. I spent over 3 years in Afghanistan. I did village stability operations, Afghan local police, PRTs, advisors to senior Afghan general officers, and then in the last year. And I've talked to a lot of them, and I've kind of seen it at the tactical level. And this idea that you're going to lead them into a peace conference, a power sharing agreement, it was only something that we could come up with.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I still am stunned by that. 2.5 plus years later,
Mm-hmm.
I'm still stunned by, reading. Did you get a chance to read Zalmay Khalizade's testimony to Congress? He gave it about 6 months ago?
Yes, I saw it.
It's very long, but very revealing. I mean, I think he was very clear. His job was to get a deal.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And even, well, I wish you could put him under truth serum. And did you really believe this would work? And I suspect he'd say he know it wouldn't.
Oh, no, there's no way. I mean, it was, we talked to a lot of the negotiators, the Afghan negotiators who were in and every one of them were like, they're just wasting, they're just dragging their feet, right? They're just trying to wait you guys out. And we talk about nothing. We're arguing about the talks before the talks. They finally had an agreement to hold the intra-Afghan dialogue, right? And while they were doing that, they were just inching closer and closer to the provincial capitals. And a lot of the offensive operations that some of them wanted to do, the Afghans wanted to do, they couldn't do. And there was a lot of corruption issues that also hurt the ANSF towards the end. But I would always say that the corruption issues were there. Ghost soldiers were absolutely a problem, especially in some of the corps and in some of the Afghan police units. But the Afghan commandos, the Afghan Air Force, and a lot of these kind of more elite units were very good. And they just got exhausted towards that last year because they were all over the battlefield,
Yeah, that was something I reported on quite a bit, how they were being misused. They weren't designed, to serve as shock troops, and yet they were. And They weren't designed to secure district centers. They were, they were very capable soldiers who were being misused. And, it's a real shame about that. And we will get to the resistance, but this is a conversation I'd really love having with you, given your experience. You had a nucleus there, as you noted, right? And they needed more time. I mean, how much more time? I can't say. But we do know what we left behind, and that is a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda running training camps.
And with American equipment.
Yeah.
And with not only American equipment, all that stuff is, MRAPs and stuff like that. But when we left, other people stayed, right? The Russians, the Pakistanis, the Chinese. So all that military equipment that we left behind, they want to have parts for it. I'm like, you don't think that You don't think the Chinese can reverse engineer some of this stuff and give it to them?
Or the Pakistanis
you
are
think
very
they won't
good
be
at
able
this.
to do their? You don't think the Taliban have an Afghan Air Force now? It's got some problems, but like they have old pilots that are flying them, and they have advisors now. It's just not us; it's the other advisors. They're there now.
If you had told me on September 12th, 2001, that we would go in, occupy Afghanistan for 21 years, only to turn it back over to the Taliban with U.S. equipment, U.S. built bases, training centers, and Al Qaeda would be in a better position today. The Taliban have full control of Afghanistan. Al Qaeda running its camps and basically having a safe haven 2.0. I mean, what was all of that worth? And it's a real. It's 2.5 years. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it.
And that's the thing. We talk about. We start talking about these resistance groups. I think the article I wrote, it's kind of similar to some of the national intelligence estimates that have come out, right? It's like, well, they don't pose a threat to the Taliban's control. And I would concur. And I would also say, like, look, it's been 2 years. I mean, almost 3 years. So, it's nothing. It takes time. As we well know, when we pushed the Talibs out, it took them a little time to regroup. But I just think that these groups, a lot of them want to do the right thing. It's just going to take them time. And that first year, I mean, losing Afghanistan and then the fall, that was very chaotic and traumatic for a lot of these groups. And so a lot of the people who left and the expats. And so I think as time moves on, a little bit of healing occurs for a lot of them. They're now more kind of posturing to be like, okay, this isn't over.
Yeah, let's get into it, Will. The article you wrote at the Long War Journal. Thanks, and it's great. Your first article for us, and I hope there's more. Titled, yeah, absolutely. Nascent Afghan resistance grows in strength, but not a threat to Taliban rule. So in the article, Will goes and details the three major Afghan groups, and So Will, let's get right into it. Sure. The National Resistance Front. This is probably the most well-known resistance group. Who runs it, and what are their capabilities?
I think so. It's run by Ahmad Massoud Jr., who's the son of legendary Mujahideen fighter Ahmad Shah Massoud, who's Northern Alliance, Jamiat-e-Islami, kind of his, if you want to put him underneath organizations, that's kind of how to do it. Out of all the groups, they're the most capable, the probably well financed. They have a pretty big presence. Ahmad Massoud just released an autobiography. So at the beginning of the war, they tried to hold Panjshir province, the birthplace of where, the Ahmad Shah Massoud and Jamiat-e-Islami during their war against the Soviet Union. But they were unsuccessful in holding that province. Massoud and then Amarullah Saleh, who was the first vice president and was a former NDS director, tried to hold there, and they were unsuccessful. And so since then, they've kind of, have been husbanding their resources and started really kind of launching their first attacks in 2022, 2023, and now 2024. They're by far the most active. They conduct attacks mostly in Kabul, Kapisa, Takhar. They've done some in Herat. Some of them have been confirmed. Some of them have not. They have a pretty good presence on the internet. And so a lot of their first, their hits tend to be much more like harassing attacks. They attack checkpoints. They might do assassinations of different district chiefs of police, stuff like that. And so that's what they've been kind of focused on. How big they are, it's kind of hard to say. How many people, and they would give you numbers. It's hard to verify, but I think by far they are the best financed, and they have the most fighters that are willing to kind of follow them. Some of them are, during my conversations with some of the people inside the NRF, they at pains to say that they try to be a multi-ethnic opposition group. I would probably guess that the vast majority of them are followers of, Jamiat-e-Islami or the older Northern Alliance, and they're mostly from the north. But they might have some representatives from throughout the country, and they do claim to have ANSF soldiers inside their organization.
So just for the listeners, on September 9th, 2001, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the father of Ahmad Shah, the current leader of the National Resistance Front, Al Qaeda killed him in a suicide attack Again, 2 days prior to 9/11, they planted a bomb and they posed as a camera crew. And that just tells you how effective Father Masood
Yes.
was in, also known as the Lion of Panjshir.
Yes.
I think Al Qaeda knew the United States was going to invade Afghanistan, and they removed probably I don't even think this is arguable, the most capable anti-Taliban leader out there. His son, Ahmed Masood, is he capable of filling the shoes of his father?
To be determined.
Yeah.
I think that, he, I mean, obviously he has his father's connections in France and inside of Europe. And he has, I think, probably more resources at his disposal for financial networks that he can rely on from Jamiat Islami and his father's. But he just did not have the same path as his father, which was basically rising up through the ranks and fighting, the Soviet Union and the previous regimes. And so he's going to have to prove himself to be an adept battlefield commander. And he does not have the experience that his father had. That doesn't mean he can't do it. It just means he's going to have to be a little bit different. But he has a very big presence. He does hold a lot of talks. So we will see, to be determined as his group continues on, how successful he can be as a resistance leader.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to judge him and the National Resistance Front based on this, but this is what we've seen, right?
Yeah.
In the after the collapse of the last Afghan government, the National Resistance Front organized in Panjshir and attempted to go toe-to-toe with the Taliban, and they were soundly defeated. This was a very quick, and I would argue very daring operation for the Taliban.
Yes.
But that was if that was his first battle, that's his first, it's a clear battlefield mistake. Now he has to learn from that.
Yeah.
And, as you said, now the National Resistance Front, they switched to more, as you described perfectly, guerrilla operations, right? Yeah. Assassinations, ambushes. That's where they have to go before they can really stand up with the Taliban. Stand up against the Taliban.
And also to in fairness to them, I mean, as I was talking to their guy, I mean, like, look, as he said, he's like, we're not just fighting the Taliban, we're fighting Al Qaeda, we're fighting the TTP, we're fighting all these other groups that are in Afghanistan now. So it's just not the Talibs, it's everybody else.
Yeah, and in that battle that we were talking about after the collapse of the Afghan government, the Taliban, Al Qaeda members were reported to be flooding into Panjshir.
Of course, yes.
And for good reason, right? They're paying back they're serving the role, right, as advisors, as trainers, but also to fight alongside the Taliban. Been a traditional role for Al Qaeda, but also they're paying their debt for Al Qaeda's for the Taliban sheltering Al Qaeda for all those years. And ironically, if you look at the United Nations Analytical Support and Sanctions and Monitoring Team, it notes that Al Qaeda is running a weapons storage depot in Panjshir province. Interesting, right? So it ties right into that point that the National Resistance Front is making. It's not just the Taliban, it's their allies. This is something, the argument you hear here in the United States is, well, it's Afghanistan, it's a local problem. But keep in mind, this is the same argument President Barack Obama made with the Islamic State when they called them the JV team that was just focused on local insurgency in Iraq and Syria. Maybe that's true until it's not. And given the history of groups like Al Qaeda,
underestimate your enemies at your own peril.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, at a certain point in time, I don't know what I don't know what to tell people anymore. Like, just because you run away from the battlefield doesn't mean your enemies aren't going to chase you. And in fact, when you're in retreat and running away, that's when you're most exposed.
Yeah, absolutely, Will. We want to end these wars, but the enemy gets a vote. And that's just the reality of the situation when they smell weakness.
I'm sure both of us, if we both felt that the Taliban and Al Qaeda and the Haqqani network and blah, 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 all of these groups were like, we're just going to stay here. And me and you actually believe that. And we're like, you know what? They're bad people and all the things, but like, they're just going to stay in Afghanistan. I don't get it, but that's not it.
Yeah, Tom Jocelyn and I always say this, right? If what happened in Afghanistan stayed in Afghanistan, we could shrug this one off, but
Yeah.
we can't because we
No.
know that is not the case. I'd be happy to believe it if I saw evidence of it, but history tells us otherwise.
Yes.
Let's move on to the
Yeah.
Afghan Freedom Front. Tell us about the group. What is it?
Yeah.
Where does it operate?
Yeah.
Leaders,
So the
methods.
leader is a gentleman named Yassin Zia, who was the last acting Afghan National Army Chief of General Staff. And then I was also the acting Minister of Defense the last year. So the COGS is what it was called. It's equivalent kind of, it would be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, right, for the Afghans. Important to realize that he was also a politician, a former provincial governor, spent the last year basically dual-hatted. He, he was, because for those that don't, the listeners who don't remember, the last Minister of Defense, Assadul Khalid, was in the hospital his last year recovering from injuries. And so Yassin Zia was dual-hatted at that point in time. So trying to organize a semblance of a defense. And so he is the leader of the Afghan Freedom Front. They kind of launched in 2022. They recently just ended an Eid ceasefire, and they've started ramping back up attacks. They are the only other group who is confirmed to be active when some of their attacks, and they're basically doing the same thing that the National Resistance Front is doing now. Is Kabul, Kapisa, somewhere around those areas where they have bases of support in the population, doing assassinations and hits on checkpoints and stuff like that. It's hard to say how big they are. I know that Yassin Zia and Masood, the two groups, have released statements together, claiming that they're working together. And that's a good thing because they really need to work together because they have the same shared common enemy. But that's really the second group, the Afghan Freedom Front.
I've seen this group claim attacks as far south as Kandahar as well. I suspect that it has a significant amount of former Afghan security personnel within their ranks. Given
Absolutely.
how I've seen them claim attacks in multiple provinces. I used to track it a lot more closely than I did now because it just sort of settled into kind of a common, and I still keep an eye on it. But that tells me that it's more that it has a wider footprint and maybe a more extensive network. Now, the National Resistance Front, in my estimation, seems to be better organized. Certainly has an excellent public relations campaign and a lot of foreign support. But this is where I think that if the two groups can merge, if it can or work more closely together, I think there would be a far more effective resistance. But yeah, they've seemed to really rely on assassinations, ambushes, all those guerrilla tactics that we would expect. Again, as you described the title, right? The nascent resistance, and that's what we're looking at right now. And the third group you mentioned, the Afghan United Front.
Yeah, so the Afghan United Front. Now they have not launched any attacks. They are at this point in time a political organization. It's led by Lieutenant General Sami Sadat, who was a corps commander in Helmand during the last year of the war, and right before it fell, they pulled him up. Gandhi pulled him up to be the head of the ANISOC, which is the Special Operations Corps. But his final year was mostly in Helmand, and he also has extensive experience inside the National Directorate of Security, which was the Afghans' premier intelligence service. So he kind of rose through the ranks, was part of the Joint Special Operations Coordinating Center, their JSOC. So a lot of their top tier commandos he worked with or led them in combat. Very socially media savvy, charismatic, speaks well. And he's also has inside of his organization Brigadier General Khoshal Sadat, who they're not a relation. Khoshal came through the American education, professional military education system. He was an aide-de-camp to McChrystal. He went to Command and General Staff College. Sami Sadat went to the same thing in Sandhurst. So they're Western trained. Khoshal Sadat he served a lot of different positions inside the Afghan military. He was basically the chief of operations for the Ministry of Interior at a certain point in time. And so I think the last place he was at was the Afghan Public Protection Police. But both of them have a lot of experience. They're very well connected, very well respected inside the Afghan Special Operations community. And they are right now have not yet launched any attacks. But at Pashtuns, this is one of the only big groups that has like Pashtuns as leaders. And this is something that, for the resistance to have a success in the future, it's going to have this multi-ethnic composition to bring in some of the Pashtuns who are against Taliban rule. And you have to have somebody like Sami and Khoshal inside of this mix. And they bring a lot of battlefield experience, a lot.
Yeah, if for anyone who hasn't seen the movie Retrograde,
yes,
it features Sami Sadat. I had the honor and pleasure of testifying alongside the General Sadat in Congress a couple of months ago, and I also met Khoshal as well. He was with General Sadat. Very impressive individuals. I spent a little time with them afterward. They're very committed to taking the fight to the Taliban, but they did explain to me that they were going to be patient about this.
Yes.
To choose their battles, take the fight. I think this is a group that probably has the most effective combat power of all of the three groups. These Sami and Khoshal are going to be able to organize many of the commandos and the special operations individuals, from the former Afghan security forces. So, them getting in, again, this is where, I kind of, these groups, they need to unify. They need to get it together, and each brings a lot to the table, has a lot of effectiveness. So, I'm just going to sort of summarize. This is sort of simplified here, but the National Resistance Front, in my estimation, gives you a nice core that actually gives you access to the north, and what I believe can be really the only country that could serve as a safe haven for these groups, which would be Tajikistan.
Yes.
The National Resistance Front is largely Tajik in nature. The Afghanistan Freedom Front gives you a wide base, and these seem to be a lot of regular army, a wide network across Afghanistan. And then Sami Sadat and his group give you that sort of the pipe swingers. As well as you had mentioned, that's a great point, right? A Pashtun face to this, and I'm not saying that face in the sense of I'm not saying that derogatory. It's something that's necessary to have a multi-ethnic, but it's effective. It's not just a token.
And the thing is I think that even for Sami, there's other people, if he chooses to bring in and make that group even more powerful. I mean, you have generals stateside who could lend in as well, like Hibatullah Alizai, who was the last ANISOC commander, and he was also the last head of the Afghan National Army. He's available. He's here. Other guys are also available, like Mustafa Wardak, who was a School of Advanced Military Studies graduate, one of the last Corps commanders as well. There are the tragedy of the Afghan war is multiple, but one of them is that for all the problems the Afghan security forces had, and I could go all day on that, but they did have a new generation of leaders who had grown up inside the America's military education program and learned from us, were committed to it, and they had just started making their way into positions of power inside the ANSF. And once that happened and we left, it's kind of, but
it was just when they were seizing that moment, right? That they could actually get rid of not get rid of, but that the warlords were becoming a little less influential, and especially within the security services. It's just sort of the tragedy of it, right?
Yes. And when a lot of people understandably would be like, well, I mean, if he's Afghan security forces, what does that say the last year and stuff like that? And I would just kind of tell people that the Afghan security forces are, people much maligned, but like compared to whose? Like compared to the Iranians, the Tajiks, the Turkmenistan, Pakistanis, yes, there was corruption issues, but they also had fighters that were very capable. Unfortunately, they were built in our own image, right? And so when the support and the enabling elements that the contractors provided, fortunately or unfortunately, were pulled out, they ground to a halt. And so these are very capable men and women who could take the fight to the Taliban, and a lot of them are willing. I think this is going to take a little bit more of an outreach by Sami and some of his guys to kind of bring in even more people.
Yeah, they're going to need it. Yeah, I keep going back to that, right? Just as guys like Sami Sadat were, beginning to take the reins, that could have been, that could lead the actual
Yes.
military, that could put their stamp on it. And
Mm-hmm.
and he understood. I talked to him. He understood the problems of corruption and what he had to deal with. It's just I just keep shaking my head on this. I mean, it's just very frustrating. But we lost patience, and we didn't.
Yes.
I would say I think the first time I was embarrassed to be an American was when President Biden stood up and said the Afghan security forces quit, and just pinned all of the blame. The Afghans deserve their share of the blame in this debacle, but
Yeah.
as you noted, we built the military in our image, not in a military that they needed to sustain. And Will, I want to, I realize it's a little bit off topic here. How would you have built the Afghan military? I have theories on this, but
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, I think that not like us, not relying on air power on demand, ubiquitous ISR assets overhead, all that type of stuff. Not technologically focused, right? Maybe building it like a national guard where people are able to, stay in their area. Like I got it. Like you're like, well, we don't want, just to be regional. I'm like, but here's the thing, like if you don't do that, then people are going to leave and go home for different things because that's their home. And in reality, like I spent a lot of time in Kandahar and doing village stability operations. And like if you're going to have people out in the hinterlands of Afghanistan, it's probably not a good idea if they're Tajik, Pashayi, Uzbeks, stuff like that. Now, we can all say and be like, well, that's not the way it should be. And I would say that's true, but that's the way it is. And so, like, design the force that you want. It's going to be able to be successful in the fight that you have, not the fight that you wish you had.
Will well said. This is, my theory as well. You needed a National Guard model with rapid reaction forces that could be what you wanted, right? With as the commandos and the special operations forces were developed to do, that was a good model. But asking a Tajik to go fight in Helmand, big mistake. I mean, and I think this contributed a bit to the collapse towards the end as well. As it started falling apart, some of these units collapsed because they just wanted to go home. They just wanted to go defend, the possibility of defending Takar or, Herat, whatever, and we're fighting in Helmand and Kandahar.
Right.
Yeah, didn't mean to go off topic there, but it's
I think that the Afghan security forces, I would say this: the fact that they had an Afghan Air Force that was capable of delivering devastating effects across the battlefield with their air power, C-130s, UH-60, the Special Mission Wing was very good. I mean, they were doing night insertions all the time with the operations tempo. They would crush the Americans. Like, I mean, this pilot rest and all that stuff. Good luck with that. There is no rest. Go.
Yeah, so. Yeah. They had a nucleus. We finally had gotten a nucleus together, and we walked away from it. All right. Well, back to the resistance. On December 4th, 2023, Lynn O'Donnell wrote a foreign policy. The title of the article: "The Taliban's enemies can't agree to anything." And then I'll quote the summary: "A summit of opposition leaders was meant to produce a plan to fix Afghanistan's trajectory. It generated more infighting and factionalism." End quote. So, were the groups that we talked about, the Afghanistan Freedom Front, the National Resistance Front, and Sami Sadat's group, were they involved in this meeting?
No, this was mostly from the National Resistance Council for the Salvation of Afghanistan, which is, I mean, these are all the former warlords that put like a kind of a big label on it. You guys like Abdul Rashid Dostum, Ata Mohammed Noor, Mohammed Mohakik, and Abdul Razul Sayef. I mean, if you're into like the old school Mujahideen guys, just because you want to nerd out about Afghanistan, I understand that this is a group that you can follow. But my personal opinion is this group's time has come and gone. These people's time has come and gone. And while you can maybe, give them thanks for defeating the Taliban or defeating the Mujahideen, or the Soviets, they failed on the battlefield. If anybody really failed, like quit, it's these guys. the Afghan security forces, I mean, 70,000 of them were killed in 20 years. While these men really were the corrupt part of the Afghan government, and they took the spoils and they kept it for themselves, and they were, in luxurious houses, all over the Middle East. And when the time came, Dostum, for all of the field marshal Dostum, Jalsjan fell very quickly, just like that. And I just don't think that these gentlemen have the wasta, if you will, to create this influence. They're only great in their own minds.
Yeah, you made me think of. I remember some video or photographs of the Taliban. I believe it was Dostum's home when they went into, and there was gold furniture, and they're putting on his fancy marshal uniform.
Yeah.
These are, you're right. These are the guys. These are the old heads. Their time, as you said, has come and gone. They were part of the problem. The reality is they couldn't have been ignored in Afghanistan post 9/11. But also, as time went on, they needed to be faded out of the big picture. Maybe they could have been regional leaders or provincial leaders, but they failed Afghanistan. I was shocked, Will, at how they sat this one out largely. At the end, I kept waiting for the old guard of the Mujahideen to at least try to retake areas of the north and the west. And they folded like a cheap suit.
They certainly did. And, Ghani foolishly thought that he could rely on them. Who, by the way, for all, I'm not a big fan of President Ghani, obviously.
Yeah, you're not? I mean.
Yeah, I know. But it's always important to remember who put him in power. I mean, that was our guy.
We strong-armed the Afghans to get him back in power. Yeah.
Yeah, we were like, hey, look, he wrote this book on international development and taking poor countries and becoming them rich, and you're just like, who cares? Like, he's a bad leader, and we kept pushing it, and he was folded. And I just think that men like Ghani, who relied on these groups of people, they are part of a regime that failed, and I just don't see a place for them in the future of a resistance that is successful. There's a lot of animosity with these people.
I've talked to several officials from several countries and asked them about these resistance groups that are the old heads, and they're, to a man, their response was they failed. They're losers, really. Yeah. They couldn't hold Afghanistan while we were there. What makes us think that they could retake it? And the other thing they said is we need young blood. And I think that the groups we talked about at the beginning, the three groups, that's definitely, if there is going to be an effective resistance, that they're going to have to be the ones that carry it, not the National Council for Salvation or whatever it is. I don't even want to mention it properly because it's not worth it, right? It's the old guard. They let Afghanistan down. They're part of the problem,
for sure.
And not the groups, not the individuals we were talking about.
Sure.
So, Will, an effective resistance. And here's what my take on it, what it requires. I always, people write books about this stuff, and I'm like, you could write this on the back of an envelope, right? This isn't rocket science, right?
Right, sure.
What do you need? You need local support. You need a significant, significant amount of the population. Is it 5%, 10%, whatever it is, right? And there's all kinds of studies on that. You need manpower, which you would get from your support, safe haven, and safe sponsorship. I usually put those two together because an external safe haven is key. Look at the Taliban did it with it in Pakistan and to a lesser degree, but no less significant in Iran. You need weapons and you need cash. I would argue unity is that you don't have to be successful, or you don't need it to be successful, but ideally you have it and you will be more successful. So do the resistance groups that we talked about, do they have these components? Do they have some of these components?
I think they have some. They obviously don't have a safe haven. I think there's areas that they can try to establish it near Afghanistan. Tajikistan, as you said, might be a possibility, but they don't have a safe haven, or if they do, they're not advertising it, which is understandable. But I think that they have a base of support in some places. is scattered. Unity, they're talking to one another. I know that Sammy and Yasin Zia know each other, and that Sammy knows who Masood, and they've all talked and stuff like that. They're appearing at an event today to talk about the resistance going forward. And so those are all positive developments and the steps toward something that can be a true threat to the Taliban's regime, but they're not there yet. And I wish they were, but to be truthful, they have to set aside their petty differences and unify. And it's just not these gentlemen. I would say that that there's a need for a government in exile to somehow like have a forcing mechanism to get even some of the other politicians who are in the United States, some of the other civil leaders, to get together and kind of be like, this is who we are. We represent those Afghans who do not want the Taliban, and these are some of the resistance groups that we're incorporated with. Until they get to a point where they're able to do something like that, I just see them. They're going to struggle. They're going to get better every year, but they have to put aside their petty differences. And look, that's been the whole ball game for 20 years when I was there, right? Trying to figure out a way for the opposition to exist peacefully and put aside all the things that they did to one another through 40 years of fighting. There's always going to be bad blood, and so, but they have a common enemy, and nobody's going to take them seriously until they can show that type of unanimity, a purpose, and then also willing to work together.
Yeah, that's well said, Will. And what popped in my mind is this is why it's a NASA resistance movement, right? They got a lot of work to do and a lot of hurdles to overcome. The final point, the U.S. official policy, I wrote about this, and I want to say it was in 2022. Way to do your research, Bill. But the U.S. State Department said that they do not support any violent resistance, armed resistance to the Taliban. So the U.S. is out as a primary state sponsor for the resistance groups. Is there any other countries out there that you think that can serve that role?
French, maybe, I don't know, with Masood. I know that he has a lot of donor networks through that. I think that Sammy has his networks throughout portions of, Central Asia that he can rely on. The Yasin Zia, who's also has Yasin Zia was also raised in in the Western kind of military tradition, so he has a lot of contacts throughout Europe as well. So there are other countries or donors who might be able to provide them. State sponsored, nothing yet. They're not there yet. But I think that there are other countries, in the region who could hedge their bets against the Taliban by providing some type of sanctuary to make sure that the spread of terrorism that is going to come, right, it's already happening out of Afghanistan, they might have something to rely on to fight them off with. So not yet, but that doesn't mean it can't happen.
Yeah, I think they have some heavy lifting to do,
yes.
Right? They have to show some success. They have to show unity.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, they'd be able to take over some small areas and be able to base out of there. But yeah, but that becomes a chicken and egg situation, right? They need weapons and cash and that's some of that external support that is required to be effective. But I really think that the best thing that they can do right now is unify.
Yes.
And one of the things I got from reading your article is that they're working towards that, and that is a positive development.
It's people in the United States are very easy to be like, well, it's been 3 years and they haven't done it. I'm like, well, that's not a long time. The first year after the fall, I mean, it was chaotic and there was, a lot of just disbelief that something like that happened, inside of the Afghan community and ours as well. So, I mean, 2 years really to kind of get their act together and start to do these things. I think as all things go, they are growing in strength. They're not there yet, but what is a better counterterrorism option for Afghanistan than some of these groups? You going to take the Taliban's word on it that you're going to keep Al Qaeda? They're going to be able to keep the Islamic State at bay? There's no way they can do that. Nor do they want to.
The Taliban can't even admit to sheltering. I was out where he was killed in Kabul, let alone admit to that he was being sheltered by the Taliban. Yeah, right. No, it's well said, Will. Look, and many of these are American or Western friendly, right? Sami Sadat and Koshal Sadat and General Zia. it's a wise choice. I think it's going to take a new administration here in the United States to change the view on that. I don't know, but I'd like to see India step into the mix here too. And to your point about it being soon, right? The Taliban really did not relaunch its guerrilla operations in Afghanistan until about 2005. So it was about I embedded with the Canadian Army in 2006, and that was when it was really starting to get underway. And wait, that's a long time ago.
I know.
Right? And I was a different me then.
Yeah, sure, me too.
Again, Bill the optimist back then. But there were things to be optimistic about, right?
Sure.
But it's a long hard path. The Taliban benefited from having right out the get-go unity, and a safe haven, and then all the things that come with that, because the Pakistani state supported them, the weapons, the cash, the ability to recruit and to go to take their wounded back to recuperate it into Pakistan, as well as Iran. It happened as well. And so, it's a even more it's a bigger or steeper uphill climb for the nascent Afghan resistance groups.
Yeah, I think it's a long way. They got a long way to go, and they know that. None of these groups would tell you like, oh, we're almost there. They understand where they are. They also understand time, and it takes time for these things, and they're far more patient than we are. And they also, believe me, when I talk to people about this, they're like, well, I don't want American boots on the ground. Here's the thing. Neither do they. I think they've seen that show a couple of times, and they don't want that to happen again. And so the support that any government or administration could give them would be financial, and maybe trying to help other regional countries, help them get a safe haven. That would be the extent of it. So would be in the first few steps. And so nobody wants to put boots on the ground and all that type of stuff. They don't want that. They don't want it either. But I think that there's a core group of people that are starting to kind of step up. And if they can work on the unanimity and start doing the attacks and marshal their resources and strategy, that's how you build. But it's early. It's not over.
No, it's not. Will, thank you so much for joining us on Generation Jihad, and look forward to having you back on soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to Generation Jihad and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again real soon.